Some of the things were done in Detroit, and then some of the other things were done in Dallas.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, Bob. You too busy?
He was the man behind Disco Lady, the very first platinum single in music history, and once the backbone of Stax Records after the tragic death of Otis Redding. With a voice baptized in gospel and sharpened in soul, Johnnie Taylor rose as the Philosopher of Soul, a hitmaker who could glide seamlessly between gospel, funk, and disco. His sound carried the fire of the pulpit and the seduction of the nightclub, a blend few could master. And yet, despite platinum records, chart-topping singles, and decades of influence, his name has been left in the shadows of mainstream history. Why did the man who gave the world its first platinum single, the artist who shouldered the weight of Stax at its most fragile moment, become one of soul's most overlooked legends? Johnnie Taylor's story is not just about music, it is about survival. It is about a preacher's son born in the Jim Crow South who found his first stage in the church choir, only to face the temptations of the secular world. It is about a man who stood in the footsteps of Sam Cooke, carried the torch of Otis Redding, and still carved a legacy uniquely his own. It is also about chaos, scandal, and the price of living the very truths he sang. This is the untold story of Johnnie Taylor, the Philosopher of Soul. Crawfordsville, Arkansas, 1934. The Jim Crow South was a place of grinding poverty, rigid segregation, and unshakable faith. For many black families of that era, the church was more than a sanctuary. It was a fortress against cruelty, a classroom of discipline, and a stage where gifts could bloom. Into this world, on the 5th of May 1934, Johnnie Harrison Taylor was born. Like countless children of his generation, his very first microphone was the pulpit, and his first audience was a congregation desperate for hope. Young Johnny's voice rang early clear, commanding, and impossible to ignore. In the small churches of Arkansas, people spoke of the boy who could lift spirits with a single note. He didn't just sing hymns, he carried them, shaping every word into a testimony. He was learning lessons far beyond melody. The choir demanded harmony, demanded discipline, demanded that a singer move hearts, not just ears. Those teachings would never leave him. They became the skeleton of the artist he would one day become. By the late 1940s, America was changing, and so was Johnny's path. His family moved north to Chicago, a city swelling with migrants from the South. Chicago was alive with possibility, but also with the restless energy of young black communities demanding more than survival. It was here that gospel music wasn't just Sunday tradition, it was becoming a cultural movement, a professional calling that could turn a church soloist into a star. Johnny slipped naturally into this world, and soon he was circling among a new generation of gospel hopefuls. He found himself in the company of the Highway QCs, a group that had already birthed one legend, Sam Cooke. When Cooke left for the Soul Stirrers, the QCs looked for a voice to step into his place. Taylor became that voice. Listeners were stunned at the resemblance. Many swore he sounded like Sam's younger brother, carrying the same silky phrasing, the same effortless ability to make scripture sound not just holy but human. For Johnny, it was a baptism into the seriousness of gospel performance. He wasn't just singing songs of praise, he was stepping into the lineage of greatness. The parallel with Cooke only deepened when Sam departed the Soul Stirrers in the mid-1950s, chasing the secular stage. Once again, Taylor was the man chosen to follow. It was no small responsibility. Cooke had been the golden boy of gospel, his voice a revelation that redefined what sacred music could sound like. To fill those shoes meant not just carrying hymns, but carrying the expectations of audiences who believed gospel should be transcendent, and Johnny rose to the occasion. His time with the Soul Stirrers honed him further. It taught him to handle pressure, to balance artistry with duty, and to stand tall in the shadow of giants. But shadows cast temptations. Gospel gave Taylor discipline, but rhythm and blues promised freedom. By the early 1960s, he felt the pull that so many gospel singers of his era faced, the call of the secular stage. The church had offered him structure, but the wider world was exploding with new sounds. Rock and roll, rhythm and blues, and soul were becoming the soundtrack of a restless generation. To stay only in gospel felt like confinement. To cross over was dangerous, but it was also irresistible. Taylor's first step into that world was with SAR Records, Sam Cooke's own label. It was a cautious test of secular waters, a chance to see if his sanctified voice could carry him into a new market. Yet even this small move was controversial. In the black church communities of the time, leaving gospel for popular music was often seen as betrayal. People whispered about backsliding, about selling sacred gifts for profit. But for Taylor, the choice was less betrayal and more destiny. He saw a world outside the church doors changing rapidly, and he refused to be left behind. Still, that leap came with heavy personal costs. Sam Cooke, the mentor who had guided him, was suddenly gone, shot and killed in 1964. It was a seismic loss, leaving Taylor shaken. Cooke wasn't just a friend, he had been a map. Without him, Johnny's path into secular music felt uncertain. Yet grief can be a forge, and Taylor's determination only hardened. He would carry Cooke's torch, but he would do it in his own way. By the mid-1960 seconds, Johnnie Taylor was no longer simply the boy from Crawfordsville, nor just the singer who had shadowed Sam Cooke. He was an artist on the verge of his own breakthrough. His voice, baptized in gospel and sharpened in sorrow, was ready to meet the gritty, sweat-soaked sound of Memphis soul. Before long, the doors of Stax Records would open, and Johnnie Taylor would step through not as an imitator of anyone, but as the philosopher of soul, ready to sing about life's pleasures, betrayals, and truths with an honesty that only he could deliver. The early 1960 seconds were restless years for Johnnie Taylor. He had stepped into Sam Cooke's shadow, sung with the Soul Stirrers, and briefly recorded under Cooke's own SAR label. But with Cooke's sudden death in 1964, the safety net was gone. Johnny had lost not only a mentor but also a guiding star. For a time, his future felt uncertain, his path towards secular music unclear. Yet the very loss that could have silenced him became the spark that pushed him to define himself. In 1966, that definition began to take shape when Taylor signed with Stax Records in Memphis. If Motown in Detroit was the sound of polish and crossover perfection, then Stax was its gritty counterpart. Motown dressed its artists in suits, aiming for white radio and suburban households. Stax embraced raw edges, the sweat of the studio, the crackle of church fervor, the heartbeat of working-class black America. For Johnnie Taylor, whose voice could soar like a preacher and seduce like a bluesman, Stax was the perfect home. His arrival, however, coincided with heartbreak for the label. In December 1967, Otis Redding Stax's brightest star was killed in a plane crash. The loss devastated the company and left a void no one thought could be filled. But in the midst of grief, Taylor emerged as a new male voice capable of carrying the banner forward. He didn't replace Otis, he offered something different, something Stax desperately needed. That need was answered in 1968 when Taylor recorded Who's Making Love. A tight Memphis groove drove the track, but it was Taylor's urgent, pleading delivery that turned it into an anthem. The song wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural moment. Selling over 1 million copies, it became Stax's biggest single to date. Suddenly, Johnnie Taylor was not simply a promising singer, he was the man. The industry now had to reckon with him. Who's Making Love also introduced the world to his new persona, the Philosopher of Soul. Unlike many singers who offered sweet ballads or romantic daydreams, Taylor delivered hard truths. His songs were less about fantasy and more about life itself, infidelity, temptation, working-class burdens, Saturday night mistakes, and Sunday morning regret. He wasn't preaching morality from a pulpit anymore. He was narrating the messy, complicated reality of ordinary people, and in doing so, he forged a bond with audiences who saw themselves in every lyric. The hits kept coming. In 1969, he released Take Care of Your Homework, a song that blended groove with a cautionary tale about responsibility and commitment. 2 years later, Jody's Got Your Girl and Gone hit the charts, another track that combined humor, pain, and streetwise storytelling. These were not songs of polished fantasy. They were slices of life set to rhythm and blues, lessons wrapped in hooks and harmonies. As the late 1960 seconds rolled into the early 1970 seconds, Taylor established himself as one of Stax's most reliable hitmakers. While Isaac Hayes was stretching soul into lush orchestral epics, and the staple singers were carrying gospel protest into the mainstream, Johnnie Taylor became the everyman's voice. His music spoke directly to black audiences in the South and Midwest, communities who knew the weight of love's betrayals, the grind of everyday survival, and the need for joy in spite of it all. What made Taylor so powerful was his duality. He could stand in a sharp suit on Saturday night, pouring velvet seduction into a nightclub microphone, and then channel the thunder of the church choir on Sunday morning. That versatility wasn't just talent, it was survival. It made him a star in the regions that mattered most to him. It cemented his place as a cornerstone of Stax during a time when the label needed both stability and fire. By the early 1970s, Johnnie Taylor had done more than simply fill a void left by Otis Redding's absence. He had carved a lane uniquely his own. His catalog reflected a philosophy of life's contradictions, pleasure and pain, loyalty and betrayal, faith and weakness. He had taken the lessons of gospel, fused them with the grit of Memphis, and turned them into a body of work that resonated deeply with those who lived through those contradictions every day. Still, as the 1970s unfolded, storm clouds gathered. The music industry was shifting. The once mighty Stax label was buckling under financial strain. And for Johnnie Taylor, the next decade would bring both his greatest triumph and his cruelest challenges. He was about to give the world a record-breaking hit that would define him forever and at the same time confine him in ways he never imagined. When Johnnie Taylor walked into Stax Records in the mid-1960s, he was stepping onto a battlefield of grief and opportunity. The label had just lost its crown jewel, Otis Redding, in a 1967 plane crash. Stax was desperate for a male voice to lead its future, someone who could keep the flame alive while the company tried to recover from tragedy. Taylor didn't just fit the role, he expanded it. His gospel-trained voice, equal parts preacher and bluesman, was exactly what the label needed to remind audiences that Stax still had soul worth fighting for. The turning point came in 1968 with Who's Making Love. A driving Memphis groove and raw urgency powered the track, but it was Taylor's vocal that transformed it into a phenomenon. He didn't simply sing the lyrics, he embodied them. His delivery carried the bite of accusation and the ache of regret, a sermon disguised as a hit record. The song rocketed up the charts, selling over 1 million copies and becoming Stax's biggest single at the time. Suddenly, Johnnie Taylor was no longer just another voice on the roster. He was the man, the philosopher of soul. The title wasn't just a nickname, it was a reflection of his art. Unlike singers who chased fantasies of perfect romance, Taylor was unafraid to sing about messy truths. His songs were filled with infidelity, temptation, betrayal, and the unglamorous weight of responsibility. They were cautionary tales wrapped in grooves, sermons built on rhythm and blues. In Take Care of Your Homework, 1969, he warned men to mind their relationships before someone else stepped in. In Jody's Got Your Girl and Gone, 1971, he turned a common urban legend of infidelity into a chart-topping anthem. These weren't polished daydreams for crossover radio. They were the lived realities of working-class Black America, given voice through his sharp delivery. Taylor's gift was making those truths feel both entertaining and sobering. He wasn't wagging his finger from a pulpit anymore. He was standing shoulder to shoulder with his audience, sharing their struggles. That connection made him a cornerstone of Stax during its most volatile years. While Isaac Hayes stretched boundaries with cinematic soul and the staple singers carried gospel protest into the mainstream, Johnnie Taylor carved his own lane. He was the everyman storyteller, giving voice to the contradictions of Saturday night thrills and Sunday morning guilt. Audiences across the South and Midwest felt that authenticity. They didn't just hear Taylor's songs, they recognized themselves in them. The factory worker juggling bills, the husband tempted by infidelity, the woman fighting for respect, all found echoes of their own lives in his records. That resonance turned Taylor into one of Stax's most reliable hitmakers, a singer who could consistently deliver music that mattered. By the early 1970s, Taylor had become more than a replacement for Otis Redding or a shadow of Sam Cooke. He had carved his own identity as the Philosopher of Soul, an artist whose catalog spoke to the complexity of love, lust, and survival. His songs carried the grit of Memphis streets, the fire of Southern churches, and the honesty of lived experience. He had created a philosophy of rhythm and blues. Sing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, because the truth is what people live. Still, While his ascent at Stax was remarkable, the industry around him was shifting fast. The label itself was staggering under financial strain, and the 1,970 seconds would soon bring seismic changes to black music. For Taylor, the next chapter would hold both his greatest triumph and his most enduring curse. Out of the ashes of Stax's decline, he was about to release a single that would make history, one that would crown him king of the dance floor, but also trap him in a box from which he could never fully escape. By the mid-1970 seconds, Johnnie Taylor stood at a crossroads. He had become a cornerstone of Stax Records, a trusted voice for audiences who wanted truth over fantasy. Yet even the strongest voices can't escape the collapse of an empire. In 1975, Stax, the label that had carried his rise, crumbled under financial ruin. For many artists, that kind of collapse spelled the end. But Taylor wasn't about to fade away quietly. Instead, he sought out a new platform that could carry him into the next era. That platform was Columbia Records. Signing with a major label was a bold step, and in 1976, the gamble paid off with a single that would rewrite music history, Disco Lady. From the moment the groove hit, it was clear this wasn't just another track. The song pulsed with the energy of the disco era, sensual, hypnotic, and undeniable. Taylor's voice, both commanding and seductive, rode the rhythm like a preacher-turned-dance floor prophet. Move it in, move it out, shaking it up, shaking it down. The refrain captured the essence of a cultural moment where nightlife was liberation. The impact was immediate and massive. Disco Lady soared to the top of the charts and, more importantly, became the very first single in music history to be certified platinum by the RIA, selling over 2 million copies. Overnight, Johnnie Taylor was no longer just the philosopher of soul, he was the king of Disco Lady. In clubs across America, his voice fueled the nights, and his name was etched into record books. Yet triumph often comes with a hidden cost. The very success that catapulted him to unprecedented heights also trapped him in a label that was impossible to shake, Disco Act. For audiences who had discovered him through Stax, he was still the soulful storyteller, the man who sang about infidelity, survival, and truth. But for the mainstream, Taylor was suddenly a symbol of a genre that critics dismissed as shallow and temporary. That branding would shadow him for decades. Unlike Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On or Al Green's Let's Stay Together songs that became timeless declarations of romance, Taylor's biggest crossover hit was tied to a genre that would soon face a brutal backlash. When disco fever burned bright, he was at the center of it all. But when the backlash hit in the late 1970 seconds, culminating in events like Disco Demolition Night in 1979, the glow of Disco Lady dimmed. To many in the industry, Johnnie Taylor became a relic of a fad, even though his catalog told a much deeper story. Still, it would be wrong to dismiss the significance of Disco Lady. It proved his versatility, his ability to adapt, and his instinct to capture the pulse of the moment. Few artists of his generation could move as seamlessly from gospel choirs to Southern soul to disco dance floors. That adaptability was both his gift and his curse. He could do everything. But the industry never knew how to define him. For Taylor himself, the success was bittersweet. On one hand, he had reached a peak few singers ever achieved, the first platinum single in history, a song that dominated radio and nightclubs, and proof that his voice could still command the mainstream. On the other hand, he had been boxed in by that very success, remembered more for a glittering dance track than for the years of grit and truth he had poured into soul music. As the 1,970 seconds drew to a close, Johnnie Taylor stood as both a pioneer and a paradox. He had made history, yet history would not always treat him kindly. The disco crown glittered, but beneath it, he remained the philosopher of soul, still wrestling with love, betrayal, and survival, and now forced to navigate a world that too often reduced him to a single, shimmering hit. For all the brilliance Johnnie Taylor displayed on stage, his private life was a storm that never settled. He had the looks, the suits, the magnetic charm, and above all, the velvet voice that could melt a heart in seconds. Women adored him, and Taylor adored women in return. But behind the charisma was a pattern he could never escape, a restless hunger for affection, a need for intimacy that led him into affair after affair, leaving broken hearts and tangled relationships in its wake. This wasn't simply the behavior of a celebrity tempted by fame. It was a defining part of who Johnnie Taylor was. The same urgency that powered his music, the raw emotion that made him believable when he sang about betrayal or temptation, was drawn from the real dramas of his own life. He wasn't just performing those stories, he was living them. By the height of his fame, Taylor was more than just a ladies' man. He was notorious. Stories spread of backstage encounters, whirlwind romances that burned bright and ended abruptly, relationships that collapsed under the weight of infidelity. He sang about cheating in songs like Jody's Got Your Girl and Gone, but in truth, he was often the Jody himself, slipping into the role of the interloper, embodying the very betrayal he warned his listeners about. His marriages suffered. Promises broke as quickly as they were made. And while he often projected the image of a suave star, the personal wreckage piled up behind the curtain. Lovers came and went, but children remained more children than anyone could fully account for while he was alive. The rumors swirled for years, whispers of secret families and unacknowledged offspring, but they stayed largely within the black community, part of the hushed folklore of the man called the Philosopher of Soul. When Taylor died in 2000, the truth burst into the open in the most public way possible. His widow believed she knew the children her husband had fathered. She thought the family circle was contained. But within days, the courthouse steps filled with new faces, young men and women who stepped forward, each claiming to be a child of Johnnie Taylor. The number wasn't 1 or 2. It was more than 9. DNA testing confirmed what many had whispered for years. Johnnie Taylor had not simply fathered a few children outside of marriage. He had fathered many. Some estimates put the total as high as 16. The revelations turned his funeral into a prelude to one of the most complicated estate battles in music history. What should have been a moment of mourning became a circus. His widow and recognized children found themselves suddenly surrounded by others demanding recognition and a share of whatever estate remained. The courtroom turned into another stage, but this time there was no microphone, no rhythm section to soften the blows. It was lawyers, DNA results, and testimonies, each one cutting away at the myth of the star. The scandal threatened to consume his legacy. Instead of headlines celebrating his role as the man behind the first platinum single in history, newspapers printed stories about his secret children, his infidelities, the mess he left behind. For many outside the black community, this was the first story they heard about him at all. To casual readers, Johnnie Taylor wasn't the philosopher of soul. He was the man with too many children and not enough fidelity. The irony was sharp. Taylor had spent decades singing about love's contradictions, the joy and the pain, the loyalty and the betrayal. And in the end, his life became the ultimate reflection of those contradictions. He was both the preacher and the sinner, the teacher and the cautionary tale. His art imitated his life, and his life, in turn, reshaped the way people heard his songs. For his children, the legacy was more personal. The fight for identity and inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about belonging, about being acknowledged by a man who had moved millions but struggled to hold his own family together. The courts could divide assets, but they couldn't resolve the ache of abandonment or the complexity of love left unfinished. And so, in the years after his death, Johnnie Taylor's story was told in 2 voices. One was the soaring tenor of the Philosopher of Soul, the man who gave the world Who's Making Love and Disco Lady. The other was the scandal of a private life that spilled into public chaos, a story of wives, lovers, and children all tangled in the same web. It is perhaps the cruelest measure of his fate that, for many, the second voice grew louder than the first. His name became shorthand for scandal long before it was celebrated for artistry. The man who had embodied the contradictions of love on vinyl was now remembered for embodying them in life. And that overshadowing became one of the great tragedies of his legacy, that the music, which deserved to stand at the center, too often found itself pushed to the margins by the chaos of the man who made it. Success can be as dangerous as failure. For Johnnie Taylor, the man who had carried Stax Records through tragedy and conquered the charts with Disco Lady, the years that followed his peak were not a triumphant march but a punishing descent. His voice remained powerful, versatile, and capable of stopping a room cold. But the industry around him was shifting like quicksand, and each change seemed designed to push him further toward the margins. The first blow had already landed in 1975, when Stax Records collapsed. Stax wasn't just a label, it was a community, a cultural heartbeat, a family for the artists it nurtured. Losing Stax meant losing more than a business contract. For Taylor, it meant losing the one company that understood his grit, his gospel roots, his need to sing about life in all its contradictions. Columbia gave him a platform, but it never gave him the sense of belonging Stax had. Then came the paradox of Disco Lady. For one dazzling moment in 1976, Taylor had reached a peak most singers only dream of. The song sold millions, made history as the first RIAA platinum single, and turned dance floors into sanctuaries where his voice reigned supreme. Yet that very success branded him. He was boxed in as a disco singer, a title that was both lucrative and lethal. When the backlash against disco exploded at the end of the 1,970 seconds, culminating in the infamous Disco Demolition Night in 1979, Taylor's crown turned into an anchor. Radio stations dropped disco records overnight. Critics dismissed the genre as shallow and disposable, and in the mainstream's rush to bury disco, Taylor was buried with it. Never mind that he had been a gospel prodigy, a soul preacher, a blues storyteller. To many outside his loyal base, he was just the guy who sang Disco Lady. The 1,980 seconds brought more challenges. The landscape of black music was transforming. R&B was leaning towards slick, electronic production. Luther Vandross ushered in an era of lush ballads. Michael Jackson turned into a global phenomenon, reshaping pop culture itself. Prince blurred lines between rock, funk, and soul. MTV gave new stars, glossy visual platforms that Taylor, rooted in old-school grit, could never quite match. There was little space left for men whose music carried the scars of lived experience, whose voices were raw rather than polished. Still, Taylor refused to vanish. If the mainstream didn't want him, he would return to the community that had built him. In the mid-negative 1,980 seconds, he signed with Malaco Records, a Mississippi-based label that became a refuge for soul and blues veterans cast aside by the majors. For some, this looked like a step down from the global reach of Columbia to a regional label tied to the so-called Chitlin circuit. But for Taylor, Malaco was salvation. It offered him what the big labels could not: freedom to make music his way, for the people who still wanted to hear him. On Malaco, Taylor released a string of albums that critics largely ignored but fans devoured. This Is Your Night, 1984, Wall to Wall, 1985, and Crazy About You, 1991, proved that his voice still carried the fire. These records may not have climbed the Billboard pop charts, but they filled clubs, jukeboxes, and southern radio waves. In small theaters and nightclubs across the South and Midwest, Johnnie Taylor became known as the King of the Chitlin Circuit, a title he wore with pride. Night after night, he performed with the same energy he once gave to sold-out arenas. His sharp suits, his confident stride, his voice husky, impassioned, unshakable, still carried the weight of every sermon he had ever sung, every heartbreak he had ever lived. For his loyal fans, there was no difference between the Johnnie Taylor who had sold millions at Columbia and the Johnnie Taylor who now sang to a few hundred in Mississippi. He was still the philosopher of soul, still teaching lessons in rhythm and blues. But survival came at a cost. Decades of relentless touring, heavy drinking, and financial strain wore down his health. Like many artists of his generation, he had been caught in a system where record companies profited from his work while he struggled to keep money in his pocket. The royalty checks rarely matched the number of records sold. The flashy image on stage often hid a quieter battle off stage, bills piling up, debts mounting, the constant hustle to keep the show on the road. The chaos of his private life added to the burden. Failed marriages, tangled romances, and an ever-growing number of children created constant turmoil. The very themes he sang, infidelity, heartbreak, betrayal, were not abstract for him. They were the daily realities of his existence, replayed off-stage in a cycle that never seemed to end. By the 1,990 seconds, Taylor was less a star chasing chart dominance and more a survivor keeping music alive on his own terms. The mainstream may have moved on, but his audience never abandoned him. In juke joints and nightclubs, his voice still drew crowds. People still wanted to dance, cry, and laughed to his music. And Taylor, ever the performer, gave them everything he had. On the 31st of May 2000, after decades of relentless performing, Johnnie Taylor's body finally gave out. He collapsed at his home in Dallas, Texas, and died of a heart attack at the age of 66. The news sent shockwaves through the soul and blues community. To his fans, Taylor was not forgotten or reduced to a disco fad. He was a giant, a living bridge from gospel's golden age to modern R&B, a man who had survived every twist the industry threw at him by doing the only thing he knew how to do: keep singing. For the world at large, the headlines too often reduced him to scandal and stereotype. But for those who saw him on stage, whether in a packed arena or a smoky Southern club, the memory was different. He was still the philosopher of soul, still a voice that told the truth, still a survivor who refused to be silenced until his final breath. When Johnnie Taylor died in 2000, the first headlines were not about the first platinum single in music history, or his role in carrying Stax records after the death of Otis Redding. They were about the chaos of his private life DNA tests, children coming forward, courtroom battles. The man who had given the world gospel fire, Memphis grit, and disco glory was reduced to tabloid spectacle. In death, as in life, scandal overshadowed genius. And perhaps that is one reason his legacy remains underrated to this day. The truth, however, is far more complex. Johnnie Taylor was one of the most versatile artists of his generation. Few singers could travel across as many musical landscapes with such ease. He sang gospel with the soul stirrers, stepping into the shoes of Sam Cooke and proving he had the voice of a preacher. He dominated the soul charts at Stax with hits like Who's Making Love, Take Care of Your Homework, and Jody's Got Your Girl and Gone. He adapted to funk grooves, then rode the wave of disco with Disco Lady, and later reinvented himself on Malaco Records as the king of the Chitlin circuit. He could move between sacred and secular, between Saturday night and Sunday morning, without ever losing his authenticity. Yet because he could do everything, the industry never knew how to market him. Marvin Gaye became the face of socially conscious soul with What's Going On. Al Green was branded the voice of sensual balladry. Sam Cooke was immortalized as gospel-turned-pop crossover. Taylor's career, by contrast, was too wide-ranging to fit into a single label. Was he the gospel prodigy, the gritty Stax hitmaker, the disco king, the blues survivor? The lack of one defining image made it harder for history to place him alongside those giants, even though his catalog was just as impactful. Timing also played a cruel role. His biggest crossover moment, Disco Lady, was tied to a genre that critics dismissed as shallow and commercial. When disco was buried in the backlash of the late 1970 seconds, Taylor's mainstream reputation was buried with it. Unlike Curtis Mayfield or Stevie Wonder, whose masterpieces became timeless political or artistic statements, Taylor's signature hit was stamped with the word disco. That label unfairly diminished its historical weight, even though the record's achievement, the first platinum certification by the RIAA, was monumental. Another reason for his underrated status lies in the nature of his songs themselves. Taylor didn't deal in fairy tales. His music wasn't about perfect love or polished dreams. He sang about the messiness of life: cheating, temptation, heartbreak, Saturday night pleasures, Sunday morning guilt. His records were mirrors, reflecting the flawed realities of human relationships. And sometimes the world prefers myths over reality. Marvin Gaye could sing of universal love, Al Green of eternal devotion, but Taylor sang of the affair that shattered a family, the husband who stayed out too late, the lover who betrayed trust. These were truths audiences lived, but they were harder for critics to romanticize. Still, the impact of his work is undeniable. For working-class black audiences in the South and Midwest, his songs were not just entertainment, they were survival soundtracks. They voiced the struggles, the joys, the temptations of everyday life, and his influence rippled outward. Hip-hop artists sampled his tracks, younger soul singers covered his songs, and blues musicians found inspiration in his Malaco years. His music has appeared in films and soundtracks, ensuring that new generations still encounter his voice, even if they don't always know his name. Perhaps the greatest measure of his legacy is the loyalty of his fans. Long after the mainstream forgot him, his audiences never did. On the Chitlin circuit, in Southern clubs and Midwestern theaters, he remained a star until his last breath. Those who heard him live in the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds speak of the same fire he had shown at Stax in the late 1,960 seconds. His voice aged but never dulled. His energy never faltered. For them, he wasn't an underrated figure. He was the philosopher of soul, still preaching truth through music when the world looked away. And that may be the paradox of Johnnie Taylor's legacy. On paper, he achieved what few ever could, chart-topping hits across multiple decades and genres, history-making sales, and a career that spanned gospel, soul, funk, disco, and blues. Yet his name rarely sits beside Marvin, Otis, Sam, or Al when we speak of soul's greatest voices. Why? Because history too often forgets those whose lives are complicated, whose stories resist easy packaging, whose truth-telling makes people uncomfortable. But for those who lived his music, for those who danced to Disco Lady, cried to Who's Making Love, or found hard-won wisdom in his Malaco records, Johnnie Taylor was never underrated. He was a giant raw, complicated, flawed, and utterly real. His place in the canon may be debated, but his place in the hearts of his people is secure. Johnnie Taylor's life was a tapestry of triumph and turmoil. He gave us gospel fire, Stax grit, disco glory, and the survival blues of the Chitlin circuit. He made history with the first platinum single, yet too often his genius was buried beneath scandal. Critics may have overlooked him, but his people never did. They heard their own lives in his voice, the betrayals, the temptations, the Sunday morning guilt. Perhaps that is the final lesson of the Philosopher of Soul. Greatness does not always come wrapped in perfection. Sometimes it comes raw, complicated, and painfully real. And while the industry may have forgotten, the people never did. In their hearts, Johnnie Taylor still sings.